You're listening to the audiobook for Elvis and the Beatles by Trina Young. Copyright 2018. All rights reserved. Chapter 5, It Was a Night. Such a night. Quote, but you're just one. At least we've got each other up there. John Lennon talking to Elvis Presley, August 1965. After Beatlemania hit America in 1964, Elvis Presley may not have dominated the charts like he did in the 1950s, but he still had some hits occasionally. On January 2, 1965, Presley reached number 1 on the US album charts for the first time in 3 years with the soundtrack for his latest film, Roustabout. It stayed at number 1 for a week, only to be knocked off the top position by the album, Beatles 65, which held the top spot for 9 weeks. The album, Beatles 65, was a US release and had a different album configuration, cover and title than any of the Beatles' official albums released in the UK. In the 1960s, US Beatles fans never saw the first 7 Beatles albums that were released in England, at least not in the same configurations. In 1963, while the Beatles were busy promoting their first 2 albums in the UK and Europe, EMI was having a hard time convincing their US label, Capitol Records, to release Beatles records in the States. As an alternative, EMI licensed several Beatles songs to smaller independent labels in the US such as VJ and Swan. In 1963, these labels put out Beatles singles like Please Please Me and She Loves You, and even an album, introducing the Beatles. However, since these labels did not have large marketing budgets, these Beatles records went virtually unnoticed in the US. Finally, Capitol agreed to get behind the Beatles and release their records starting in December 1963. It then seemed logical that the record company would release the band's first 2 albums, Please Please Me and With the Beatles, which fans across the pond had been enjoying for several months. By October 1964, Capitol had recovered the US rights to all EMI Beatles recordings from VJ. However, the US record executives had a whole different strategy for releasing Beatles records. They did not want to sell the same Beatles albums released in the UK because those albums featured 14 songs. Capitol thought it would be better for business to release new Beatles albums with only 11 or 12 songs featuring different song configurations. So, while John, Paul, George and Ringo spent their precious time specifically choosing songs for each of their UK albums, Capitol ended up rearranging, adding and removing songs to those configurations, resulting in noticeably different album versions. You could say the first 7 Beatles albums were butchered by Capitol, all in the name of business. Quote, we made only, say, 10 albums actually, and in America there seemed to be 30 of them, John Lennon said in a 1974 radio interview. We would sequence the albums how we thought they should sound. We put a lot of work into the sequencing. We almost got to not care what happened in America because it was always different. It used to drive us crackers, 'cause we'd make an album and then they'd keep 2 from every album, unquote. Although they were extremely unhappy with what Capitol was doing with their albums, the Beatles unfortunately had no control over it, until finally the record executives had no other choice but to follow the Beatles' lead. The turnaround happened with none other than the Beatles' groundbreaking album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Since it was a concept album which did not have breaks between the songs, how could Capitol rearrange and butcher the album but still keep the record's artistic integrity? Luckily, the tide had changed. Sgt. Pepper and the Beatles' remaining albums were, for the most part, kept intact for US fans. Also, the fact that the Beatles started their own record label, Apple, in 1968 also helped the group retain control over their album releases. Surprisingly, John Lennon revealed years later that he preferred singles over albums. Quote, I'm not an album person, Lennon confessed. There have only been 2 great albums that I listened to all the way through when I was about 16. One was Carl Perkins' first or second, and one was Elvis's first. Those are the only ones on which I really enjoyed every track, unquote. In the 1950s, when Elvis began recording, the industry focused on singles rather than albums. Elvis played a major role in deciding what songs would be released as singles, especially early in his career. However, like the Beatles, Elvis experienced a similar lack of control over his album releases. Quote, "The selections on both Loving You and King Creole were dictated by the movie's requirements," explained historian Ernst Jorgensen. The first RCA album contained 5 previously rejected Sun masters, and when the second, Elvis, came up short of material, the extra time had been taken up with 3 Little Richard covers, unquote. Furthermore, in the early 1960s, Presley's studio albums, like Elvis Is Back, did not do well on the charts because hits like Stuck on You, It's Now or Never, and Are You Lonesome Tonight were not included on the album. Quote, "At the Colonel's insistence, Elvis's hits were assembled on special collections such as the Golden Record series," explained Jorgensen. The rest of the session material, minus the hits, were released on albums like Elvis Is Back, or the aptly named Something for Everybody and Potluck, unquote. In addition, the buying public was more interested in Presley's movie soundtracks compared with his studio albums. As a result, the studio album tracks got less exposure and little radio airplay. Nevertheless, the song selection by Presley on Elvis Is Back was imaginative and varied, Jorgensen described. It was as if Elvis had invented his own brand of music, broken down the barriers of genre and prejudice to express everything he heard in all the kinds of music he loved, unquote. Originally released on April 8, 1960, Elvis Is Back was Presley's first album to come out after his 2-year service in the Army. This album featured a mix of R&B, pop, and blues, prompting the publicity department to tout, "You never heard him like this before." However, by 1962, Presley's ability to pick a hit started to wane. Suspicion, a song written by Pomus and Schumann for Elvis, had been considered as a single from the Potluck album in 1962, but instead, Presley picked She's Not You. It was a disappointment that the single only reached number 5. Quote, "Neglecting that side of his career for so long, Elvis's judgment on commercial material was no longer assured," said music journalist Ray Connolly. For 2 years, the music he had been enjoying at home had borne no resemblance to the movie albums he'd been making, unquote. Notably, an Elvis sound-alike, Terry Stafford released Suspicion as a single 2 years after Presley's recording, and it hit Billboard's top 10 in April 1964. As a result, RCA decided to release Presley's version as a single 1 month later. Ironically, Stafford's version of Suspicion was one of the 2 songs which halted the Beatles' run of the top 5 spots on the chart on April 4, 1964 by rising to number 3 the following week of April 11, 1964. Presley's version had been released too late to gain the public's attention and failed to make it into the Billboard Hot 100. Presley's recording career was now dominated by frivolous movie soundtracks. According to historian Ernst Jorgensen, quote, "Elvis had become a kind of hired hand, farming out his services through RCA and the Colonel to the highest bidder with the least amount of effort. This was nothing like making real records, sometimes it hardly seemed like making music at all," unquote. On April 28, 1965, the Beatles were presented the Grammy Awards for Best New Artist for 1964, and for Best Vocal Performance by a Group for A Hard Day's Night. They received the awards from actor Peter Sellers at Twickenham Studios in England, where they were filming their second movie, Help. Meanwhile, at the same time, Elvis just completed filming his 19th movie in Hollywood called Harum Scarum. Gossip columnist Hedda Hopper called Presley the highest-paid star in show business. Quote, "Elvis is as big in Tokyo, Bangkok and Johannesburg as he is in Keokuk, New York, London or Berlin. His records annually account for at least 10% of RCA Victor's business and have grossed a total of $150 million to date," unquote. On May 28, 1965, Chris Hutchins reported in the NME that another attempt for the Beatles to meet Elvis during their upcoming U.S. tour in the summer of 1965 would again meet failure. Quote, "I have it on the best authority that the Presley home in Beverly Hills will be bolted and vacant, by a strange coincidence, when our famous 4 take up residence in the star-studded belt around the film city for a whole week at the end of August," wrote Chris Hutchins, due to the fact that Elvis was scheduled to be filming on location in Hawaii. Tom Diskin, Colonel Parker's right-hand man, assured Hutchins, as he reported in the article, that this conflict of schedules was not intentional on Presley's part. Quote, "After talking to Paul McCartney on the phone last summer, Elvis just can't wait to spend some time with them," said Diskin. I can't tell you how thrilled he was to receive a wire from them recently congratulating him on his 10th anniversary in show business, unquote. On May 5, 1965, the American musical variety show Shindig devoted an entire episode to Elvis Presley to celebrate the 10th anniversary of his rise to fame. Music stars of the day, including Sonny and Cher and Glenn Campbell, sang cover versions of Presley's most famous songs. Quote, "The music business predicted that the Elvis Presley craze was all a flash in the pan," said Shindig host Jimmy O'Neill to the viewing audience. Well, 10 years later, we on Shindig are here to say that Elvis is still the king, unquote. Elvis still represented the pinnacle of success in rock and roll, and he set the model for the Beatles' achievement of success. Brian Epstein's goal of the Beatles becoming bigger than Elvis helped propel the band into worldwide fame, which in some ways surpassed the king. However, McCartney later clarified how the Beatles felt. "We never wanted to beat him," Paul explained. "We wanted to coexist with him," unquote. On August 18, 1964, when Brian Epstein arrived in San Francisco for the Beatles' U.S. tour, he received a telegram dated August 17 from Colonel Parker offering his help. Parker also expressed best wishes from Elvis and himself for a successful Beatles tour in the U.S. A few days later, Parker sent a second telegram to Epstein in Seattle expressing the same sentiment. The telegram dated August 20, 1964 was addressed to Brian Epstein and the Great Beatles. These telegrams led to McCartney calling Presley 2 weeks later as recounted in the previous chapter. Quote, "If there is anything I can be of service with as a friend, do not hesitate to call on me," Colonel Parker wrote in the telegram. "Give my best to Chris Hutchins, and if you have time, give me a call when you come to town," unquote. On August 24, 1964, Hutchins arranged a meeting between Colonel Parker and Brian Epstein which took place at the Beverly Hills Hotel. They began discussing security measures needed during the Beatles' concert tour. Parker gave Epstein useful ideas for handling the Beatles at hotels and transportation to and from the concert venues based on strategies he used for Elvis during his 1956 and 1957 tours. Quote, "You don't have to protect the Beatles as we protected Elvis," Parker said to Epstein, "because with them there is no jealousy. You don't have to fear the boyfriends as we did because your artists are characters loved in a different way," unquote. The Colonel described how angry boyfriends would throw things at Elvis on stage. Quote, "We never had to send the police in to get them, though, the girls always got them first," unquote. Brian Epstein then asked if Presley would ever tour again. The Colonel said he would like for Elvis to tour again someday, but that currently Elvis was making more money doing movies. He suggested that this would one day happen to the Beatles. Parker also praised Epstein for managing so many clients at once. Quote, "Elvis has required every moment of my time," Parker explained, "and I think he would have suffered had I signed anyone else, but I admire you, Brian, for doing it. Obviously you have a different organization, but remember, too, that when Presley soared to fame, I was 44. When the Beatles happened, you were 28. That helps," unquote. While the two men seemed like total opposites on the surface, underneath they were more alike than most realize. Many observers would assume Colonel Parker wanted fame and attention just like his famous client, seeing how he constantly inserted himself in publicity stunts for Elvis. For years, he had promised to write his own autobiography, but never did. Years later, Parker said his book would be called, "How Much Does It Cost If It's Free?" The book would be published just as soon as I sell all the ads in it, Parker joked. If the book's never published, all who've taken out ads will get back 50% of their deposit, unquote. However, Brian Epstein, who appeared much more humble in his relation to the Beatles and their fame, wasted no time in publishing his own memoir during the height of the Beatles' success in 1964. Quote, "I don't dress fancy, but I guess we've a lot in common otherwise," Parker concluded to Epstein at their 1964 meeting. In his autobiography, A Cellarful of Noise, Epstein shared his behind-the-scenes life managing the Beatles and made some intriguing observations. He described John Lennon as, quote, "a most exceptional man." Had there been no Beatles and no Epstein participation, John would have emerged from the mass of the population as a man to reckon with. He may not have been a singer or guitarist, a writer, or a painter, but he would have most certainly been a something. You cannot contain a talent like this, unquote. Brian said Paul McCartney was temperamental and moody, although he regarded him as a world star. George Harrison was easy to be with, and Ringo Starr was warm and wry-witted. They are very fine, extraordinary young men, Epstein concluded. I don't believe anything like them will happen again, unquote. Following their 1964 meeting in Beverly Hills, Colonel Tom Parker and Brian Epstein, along with reporter Chris Hutchins, worked together to arrange the historic meeting between the King and the Fab Four that would take place in Los Angeles 1 year later. Quote, "We tried for years to, but we could never get to him," Paul McCartney later explained. "We used to think we were a bit of a threat to him and Colonel Tom Parker, which ultimately we were. So although we tried many times, Colonel Tom would just show up with a few souvenirs and that would have to do us for a while. We didn't feel brushed off, we felt we deserved to be brushed off. After all, he was Elvis, and who were we to dare to want to meet him," unquote. On March 7, 1965, Elvis talked about the Beatles in an interview with a Memphis newspaper. Quote, "He buys the Beatles records and likes them despite the fact that they are competition," wrote reporter James Kingsley. When the hirsute Britishers made their first American tour, Elvis jokingly sent them a toy pistol, with the clear implication that it was to be used for self-destruction. Quote, "It was all in fun and a good joke," Presley told Kingsley. "I am happy for them. They are a great group and they, as I did, played anywhere and for any amount of money before hitting the top," unquote. And the Beatles truly were on top. On August 15, 1965, they played a concert at New York's Shea Stadium. The show broke records with 55,600 people attending, the largest concert audience ever in rock and roll history up to that point. The Beatles doubled the size of the biggest crowd that Elvis had performed for, which was 26,500 at the Cotton Bowl in Dallas in October 1956. Continuing on their 1965 American tour, a few days later, the Beatles were asked about Elvis. While Presley always stayed polite and positive when it came to public statements about his musical competition, the Beatles had no filter. 1 week before they got to meet Elvis, they said this about him at a press conference in Atlanta, Georgia. Question: "What do you think of Elvis Presley?" John: "We liked his early stuff, you know." Paul: "We liked it a lot more than the stuff that he does now." John: "We still play his." Paul: "He was wilder then, you know, and he's gone a bit middle-aged. You know the image. You know what I mean. We still like him, though," unquote. The stars aligned in August 1965 when Presley's shooting schedule allowed him to return early from filming in Hawaii back to Hollywood. On August 27, 1965, the day the actual meeting took place, a story ran in the New Musical Express by Hutchins with the headline, "NME is arranging a meeting between Elvis and Beatles." The day before, Hutchins had met with Colonel Parker at Paramount Studios and then got a surprise meeting with Elvis on set. Elvis asked Hutchins how the Beatles were doing at their rented house. Quote, "My girlfriend drove up around there yesterday and said there were a heck of a lot of fans outside," Presley said. "Those guys can't get much peace at all," unquote. At the end of the day of filming, Hutchins took Colonel Parker up to the Beatles' house where the Colonel assured the Fab Four that they would get to meet Elvis, after a convenient time and place was decided on. Quote, "Elvis is keen to entertain them at his rented home in Bel Air," reported Chris Hutchins. But the Beatles are besieged by fans in their home in Benedict Canyon. Their departure wouldn't be easy. On top of which they both have managers keen to preserve their artists' prestige, continued Hutchins, and neither man is falling over himself to send his star act around to see the other. "Now I have the job of setting up the meeting on neutral territory," unquote. In truth, Colonel Parker easily persuaded Brian Epstein to have the Beatles come visit Elvis. According to Beatles publicist, Tony Barrow, Parker's argument was that Elvis would happily come to the Beatles if they were all in England, but here in America on Presley's home turf it should work the other way around. Quote, "So many things could have gone wrong," said Presley's friend Jerry Schilling. "If Colonel and Brian hadn't gotten along, it wouldn't have gotten past the phone call stage. But there were no ego battles, and from the start it was approached as a pair of music greats coming together out of admiration for each other, unquote. Finally, it happened. The most infamous rock and roll meeting of all time occurred when Elvis Presley met the Beatles face-to-face for the one and only time. On August 27, 1965 around 10 p.m., John, Paul, George and Ringo along with their manager, publicist and assistants came to Presley's house on Perugia Way in Los Angeles to meet their rock and roll idol. Unfortunately, as Hutchins stated, Colonel Parker, with the agreement of Brian Epstein, insisted that no pictures or video be taken of the infamous meeting. Therefore, this historic event is recounted solely through eyewitness accounts from the people who were there. Quote, Colonel Parker was such a control freak, explained Larry Geller. You never saw a picture of the meeting between Elvis and the Beatles, have you? Because the Colonel was afraid that maybe the Beatles or Brian Epstein would get the pictures, unquote. It was a typical night at Presley's home with members of Elvis's entourage on hand as well as a few of their female companions including Presley's live-in girlfriend and future wife, Priscilla Beaulieu. Also added to the mix was Colonel Parker who was there on this special occasion to make sure things ran smoothly. Quote, everything was quite secretive, explained Priscilla Presley in 2015. Not a big deal was made about it because no one wanted it to get out in the press, especially Colonel Parker, and he would say how no one could say anything. He waited last minute to tell us all the plans and what was happening. Elvis kind of just went along with the program. He was looking forward to meeting them, unquote. Of all the Beatles, John Lennon was probably the most nervous about the meeting since Elvis was literally John's hero. If it hadn't been for him, would have been nothing, Lennon told Elvis's friend, Jerry Schilling. Colonel Parker and Presley's road manager, Joe Esposito, escorted the Beatles and their small entourage over to Presley's house in 3 limousines. Elvis was in the den when the Beatles arrived. They were so excited but so nervous, recalled Priscilla Presley. You could hear a pin drop when they walked in. I was amazed at how shy they were, unquote. As the Beatles walked into the den, John Lennon launched into an imitation of Peter Sellers' character, Inspector Clouseau, by saying, "Oh, there you are, Elvis." Everyone laughed. After all the introductions, the Beatles sat down on the couch next to Elvis who was watching a muted TV, while music was playing in the background on a jukebox. Initially, there was an awkward moment of silence as the Beatles appeared starstruck and just stared at Elvis. Quote, they were speechless. They were totally speechless, recalled Priscilla. They were truly like kids meeting their idol, especially John Lennon. John was shy, timid, looking at him. I really believe that he just couldn't believe that he was actually there with Elvis Presley. It was a little bit awkward because they just kept looking at him, and not really saying anything and not really sitting down, just staring at him. It felt like it was a long time, unquote. Finally, Elvis broke the silence, quote, if you guys are just gonna sit there and stare at me, I'm going to bed, unquote. The Beatles laughed. I just thought we'd sit and talk about music and maybe jam a little, Elvis proposed. He then called for guitars to be brought into the room for John, Paul, and George. Sorry there's no drum kit for you, Elvis told Ringo. We left that back in Memphis. That's okay, Ringo replied. I'd rather play pool. Some accounts claim that Ringo kept the beat on the side of an armchair. However, Ringo claimed years later in the Beatles anthology that he never jammed with Elvis. At that point in the night, many people said that Ringo got up and went to play pool in the other room with Presley's friends including Jerry Schilling and Billy Smith. Meanwhile, Elvis was sitting on the couch playing a Fender bass which excited Paul McCartney, quote, it was a great conversation piece for me. I could actually talk about the bass, and we sat around and just enjoyed ourselves, McCartney said. Beatles publicist, Tony Barrow, recalled, Elvis strummed a few chords for Paul and said, not too good, huh? But I'm practicing, unquote. Both Paul McCartney and Jerry Schilling remembered that the song, Mohair Sam, by Charlie Rich was playing on Presley's jukebox. Elvis was playing bass along with the record. Quote, in front of the TV, he had a massive big bass amplifier with a bass plugged in it, and he was playing bass all the time with the picture up on the TV, John Lennon recalled. So we just got in there and played with him. We all plugged in whatever was around and we all played and sang, unquote. George Harrison decided to take a break and go smoke a joint outside. Maybe this is why George also said years later that he never took part in any jam session. I never jammed with Elvis at all, Harrison told McCartney and Starr in 1995 in the Beatles anthology. No, John said he did, replied McCartney. It must have been when we went out of the room, said Harrison sarcastically. I think it was because he had a bass there, replied McCartney. McCartney did not definitively refute the possibility that he took part in a jam session, possibly because the memories of he and his fellow bandmates seemed to remain fuzzy. We remember it well, McCartney jokingly said later in the same conversation. Paul asked Elvis if he could try one of Elvis's guitars, described Larry Geller. Elvis says, "Sure man, go right ahead." So Paul picks up one and starts strumming, followed by John and then Elvis too. So the three of them start jamming for about 20 minutes and I think, this is unbelievable. I'm in the center of the universe right now. The Beatles and Elvis, unquote. Sonny West, one of the Memphis Mafia, recalls that some of the songs Elvis and the Beatles jammed to that night included Cilla Black's "You're My World" and Chuck Berry's "Johnny Be Good." Quote, "They went and got a couple of acoustic guitars and sat around and started playing some old songs," said Joe Esposito. You know, oldies, but goodies songs, Chuck Berry tunes and just some instrumentals. I mean, that's what I remember. Some guys say they didn't play. Some guys say they do. I heard them, I thought. Unless I'm losing my mind too, unquote. Some accounts claim that later in the evening, since there were no left-handed guitars on hand, Paul McCartney moved over to play the white piano that was in the corner. At one point, Presley competitively joked, "This is what you guys gave me for my 30th birthday. It made me sick." Elvis laughed and then started playing the bass part for the Beatles' hit single, "I Feel Fine." The Beatles roadie, Mal Evans, remembered Elvis asking for a guitar pick. Evans, who happened to be a huge Presley fan, said, "There was Elvis playing bass, Paul and John on guitars, and I just sat there with my mouth open all night," unquote. The Beatles chauffeur, Alf Bicknell, described the impromptu jam session, quote, "There was no singing, it was more a case of showing each other different guitar licks. Little blues riffs, a bit of 12-bar and so on," unquote. In truth, it was more like a Lennon-McCartney-Presley jam session. The jam session of mostly rhythm and blues songs lasted about 45 minutes. Later, the Beatles started talking to Elvis about music and touring. John and Elvis talked about how they both loved Peter Sellers movies. "This is the way it should be," John Lennon said in his Peter Sellers voice, eliciting a smile from Elvis. "The small homely gathering was a few friends and a little music," unquote. One awkward moment came when John asked Elvis, "Why have you dropped the old stuff, the rock? I loved the old Sun records." "It's my movie schedule," Elvis replied. "It's so tight. But maybe I'll do one just for kicks." "Then we'll buy it," John replied with a smile. When Elvis shared stories about being physically threatened from frenzied fans at his concerts, John Lennon remarked, "But you're just one. At least we've got each other up there. If somebody pushed me on stage and said, 'You're on your own,' like they did with you, I'd just break up." George told Elvis a similar story about when he had been flying from Liverpool and the window beside him had suddenly sprung open, John Lennon recounted. "Yeah," agreed Elvis again. "We pay the price for fame with our nerves, don't we?" Meanwhile, Brian Epstein and the Colonel sat chatting at the back of the room. Then they went into the game room, which had a pool table and a roulette wheel. As the Colonel played host to Brian Epstein, he announced to the room, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis's private casino is now open for your pleasure. Brian, let's play roulette." According to Tony Barrow, Parker put his arm around Epstein. Brian then brought up the subject of promoting shows for Elvis in the UK. The Colonel pretended to leave the door open, by saying he'd think about it. Also, the idea had been suggested that the Beatles sing one song with Elvis at the end of Paradise Hawaiian Style. However, the Beatles' movie deal with United Artists prohibited that. Later in the evening, Elvis gave his guests a tour of the house. Quote, Elvis wanted to show them a gift he just got from Colonel Parker, a wooden sauna, described Larry Geller. So we all walked up to the sauna and Paul looked in the glass little window and said, "Who's that?" We opened the door and under the wooden seat there was this 15-year-old girl scrunched down under it, and she screamed and leapt into Elvis's arms. Elvis was looking at us. We're all laughing and we pried her off of him, but we never could figure out how she got in that house, unquote. I also remember I talked to him about cars, recalled John Lennon. Everyone knew how much he loved them, and he'd just got himself a Rolls-Royce Phantom 5. Snap, I told him. I saw it outside. Mine is just the same except I've had all the chrome bits painted black. It was 2 a.m. when we finally quit. Elvis had been a great host and gave all of us a complete set of his records. It was a night none of us would forget, unquote. Elvis wanted to show the guys his Rolls-Royce, said Larry Geller. So we go outside to the car compound and the fans get to see Elvis and the Beatles together. It was an explosion of screaming. It was like these two mantras, "We love you Beatles. We love you Elvis." It was like this back and forth thing, so we quickly went back into the house, unquote. It was Elvis's sense of humor that stuck in my mind, said Lennon. He liked to laugh and make others laugh too, which was why I put on a Peter Sellers voice again as we walked out of the door and said, "Thanks for Z music, Elvis, and long live Z King." While many stories circulated in later years that the meeting was a flop or that either the Beatles or Elvis were disappointed, that doesn't seem to be the case. Elvis appeared to have enjoyed himself. He told Sonny West, "That was a lot better than I thought it would be. That's some good times there." Also, after the Beatles left that night, Elvis told friend Larry Geller, "I like those guys, I like them, but what the hell's wrong with their teeth, man?" Although there were no official photos taken, a fan waiting outside took a few candids at the end of the night as Elvis came outside to watch the Beatles get into their limos and leave. NME reporter Chris Hutchins appears in 2 of the 4 rare photos that were taken that night. In one photo, Elvis, in a red shirt and black jacket, stands behind Hutchins, who is wearing dark sunglasses. Quote, "What was shocking was that fans were lining up and coming around the gate and knew something was going on, knew the Beatles were coming," explained Priscilla. "And we were going, how could this happen? This was all very secretive. All of a sudden there were like 100 fans out in front of the gate waiting for them to come. We learned later that Colonel planned all of that," unquote. On September 3, 1965, the NME ran their exclusive cover story on the meeting. The headline stated, "Elvis meets Beatles." NME's Chris Hutchins was the only reporter at this historic event. The article's subtitle read, "Chris Hutchins brought the 2 greatest pop attractions on Earth together and tells NME readers in a vivid word picture what happened at Elvis's Bel Air home." In the article, Hutchins states that there was an informal jam session which started with Elvis playing the bass along to records playing on his jukebox. John, Paul, and George were reportedly provided with guitars. However, there was no drum set for Ringo. They used language of music, a call-out in the article read. This inevitably formed the basis for the never-ending stories provided by friends of Elvis who were there that night as well as members of the Beatles' entourage. A day later on September 4, stories about the meeting also appeared in UK publications Disc Weekly and Melody Maker. The articles repeated many details from Hutchins' story with additional quotes from the Beatles. A US publication, National Blast Weekly, ran a cover story on October 10, 1965 with the headline, "Beatles Meet Elvis, Exclusive Details." While some of the eyewitness accounts that have come out over the years may be embellished or dispute what actually happened that night, one thing that should be clear is who was actually there. The Beatles' publicist, Tony Barrow, confirmed that Hutchins was present, quote, "Having acted as a catalyst to get the whole shindig off the ground, of course Chris Hutchins had to be invited. And if even a single journalist was to be involved, the Beatles wanted to bring me along. Presley would have his army of Minders, the self-styled Memphis Mafia, on hand, so the Beatles' roadies, Neil and Mal, made it onto the swelling list of guests, along with their driver, Alf Bicknell." John said, "Let's stop there or it'll get out of control." The deal with Hutchins was that there would be no pictures, no taping, no leaking of details in advance, Tony Barrow explained in a 1994 essay. Keeping the time and place confidential was in his interests because Hutchins would have the story exclusively to himself. The Beatles manager, Brian Epstein, was nervous about a leak and warned me, "The boys will pull out if the rest of the press find out," unquote. However, there were other reporters present outside the house along with the crowd of fans who found out about the meeting. Quote, several of the most enterprising guys, including Daily Express West Coast correspondent Ivor Davis and the intrepid Larry Kane, joined forces to tail our limousines as we left the Beatles' villa, Tony Barrow explained. Chris Hutchins has gone on record stating that there were no other reporters present inside the house as the famous meeting took place. I can assure you that I was the only journalist present on the night I arranged for the Beatles to meet and spend some time with Elvis Presley in August 1965. The Colonel insisted that A, the meeting had to be at Elvis's house, B, there were to be no photographs taken or recordings made, and C, there were to be no journalists other than me present and no hangers-on in Elvis's house. I am aware that others have claimed to be there and written accounts, largely using information I published later with the consent of the Beatles, the Colonel and Brian Epstein. Rest assured they were not there, unquote. Over the years, there has been some controversy as to whether there really was a jam session between Elvis and the Beatles. The one person in Presley's entourage who said there was no jam session was Memphis Mafia member, Jerry Schilling. In his 2006 book, Me and a Guy Named Elvis, Schilling said, quote, "Maybe it would be better history if this meeting of great talents had turned into some phenomenal jam session or an outrageous, headline-making party, but in fact it had the quiet, easygoing feel of most get-togethers at the house," unquote. However, as with many memoirs, the memory can be fuzzy. 1 year after his book was published, Jerry was featured on a live radio special called the GK Super Session on Sirius XM's Elvis channel with fellow Memphis Mafia members, Joe Esposito and George Klein. When the meeting between Elvis and the Beatles came up in conversation, Joe Esposito was talking about the jam session and Jerry questioned him about it. Schilling asked if there really was a jam session and Esposito confirmed that there was. Schilling remarked that he must have been in another room probably playing pool with Ringo and didn't realize that happened. Quote, Jerry Schilling must have had plugs in his ears because you couldn't miss hearing Elvis and the Beatles singing and playing, said Memphis Mafia member, Marty Lacker. We were gathered around the piano and they were trading Chuck Berry songs as well as Elvis singing a couple of Beatles songs. Elvis and Paul alternated at the piano and Lennon was playing a guitar. Ringo was beating on a chair because there were no drums and George took turns joining in and then going out by the pool to smoke a joint. It's funny that Ringo has no recollection of it, as he stated during an interview, Lacker continued, and George one time said they did and another time they did not. My ears and the ears of most of the wives and kids that were there listened intently and I have always had a very good memory, unquote. Playing the instruments certainly helped us feel at ease with Elvis, John Lennon later said. It was one of the great meetings of my life, said Paul McCartney. I think he liked us. I think at that time he may have felt a little bit threatened, but he didn't say anything. We certainly didn't feel any antagonism, unquote. He was exactly as I thought he would be, said George Harrison. Very friendly, very hospitable, easy, relaxed and very interested in us and our music. A real star in every sense of the word, unquote. Fantastic, Ringo said about the meeting. He was just like one of us, none of the old Hollywood show-off thing, unquote. It was nice meeting Elvis, said John Lennon. He was just Elvis, you know. He just wasn't articulate, that's all. He seemed normal to us, and we were asking about his making movies and not doing any personal appearances or TV, unquote. He was everything I expected him to be, said the Beatles roadie, Mal Evans, who was a current member of Presley's fan club in England. You know, he's good-looking, made you feel at ease. He's just every bit as I expected him to be after 9 years being a fan. I really am a big Elvis fan, at 6'3" I'm one of the biggest, unquote. In all the excitement, Evans sent his suit to the cleaners to prepare for the big meeting with Elvis. However, the cleaners had sewn up his pockets where he kept a bunch of his guitar picks that he always had on hand for the boys. So, inevitably when Elvis asked for a guitar pick that night, Mal went into a panic. Evans couldn't access the picks, or plectrums as they call them in England, in his sewn-up pockets, so he frantically ran into the kitchen and smashed up a bunch of plastic spoons to create makeshift picks. Mal was so disappointed by that mishap. "I'd have loved to have given Elvis a pick, have him play it, then got it back and had it framed," unquote. The next day, some of the Memphis Mafia went to hang out with the Beatles at the house where they were staying in Los Angeles. Elvis declined the invitation. Lennon told them, "Last night was the greatest night of my life." Later that year, Paul McCartney and John Lennon called Graceland to speak to Elvis. They wanted to thank him for the visit in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Brian Epstein wrote to Colonel Parker thanking him for his hospitality at the meeting. The colonel responded by writing to Brian, "You owe me no thanks, for friends don't have to thank each other." On September 14, 1965, Elvis and the colonel sent a telegram to Ringo Starr care of Brian Epstein, on the occasion of the birth of his first son, Zachary. It read, "Dear Ringo, congratulations to you and the missus on the new member of your family. If Colonel Epstein is not interested in signing this new artist, ship tape with voice track. Regards, Elvis and the Colonel." Around this time, there were rumors that the Beatles would not be touring Britain after their return from their US tour. Fans feared that the group would be retreating from the public limelight, or in other words, the Beatles were going to do a bit of a Presley. George Harrison responded to the news that the group wouldn't be touring again until November of that year. "I suppose you could say we're doing a bit of a Presley. But it's not really planned that way," unquote. A few months later, Elvis released a surprising statement about the Beatles, quote, "People have said my absence from personal appearances has given the Beatles their big opportunities. I know nothing about that. As for the Beatles, all I can say is, more power to them. I have watched all of their television appearances over here. I don't think I should say what I feel about them. It wouldn't be fair to fellow entertainers. I'll say the Beatles have got what it takes and in great abundance and that they've been given a heck of a vote of confidence. I'm sorry, but I have to be diplomatic and I'm honest about it. They are entertainers like myself and I guess they're as dedicated as the rest of us. Which, in the long run, is all that matters. I wish them luck," unquote. The lyrics to the song, "The Hard Day's Night," were quite accurate. The Beatles were working like dogs. When they weren't performing live or on television or on their BBC radio show, they were writing a large amount of songs and recording them. Quote, "Brian Epstein and I worked together very closely planning their future, and we agreed that we should put out a single every 3 months and an album every 6 months, said producer George Martin. In just under 4 years, from October 1962 to August 1966, the Beatles officially released 7 albums and 13 singles in the UK. That amounted to 113 different songs in 46 months, an average of 1 song every 12 days. And virtually every single and every album was a hit. Writing lots of songs is not particularly difficult, explained composer Howard Goodall. Volume is not the thing. The extraordinary thing about the Beatles is the amount of great songs, which is why I think you can compare them in some ways to Schubert and Mozart because of the sheer volume of the invention," unquote. With a great number of songs also came a great opportunity for experimentation. Lennon and McCartney's songwriting evolved, and George Harrison began writing songs. Inside the Abbey Road recording studio, the band's musicianship started expanding beyond just the 4 instruments of bass guitar, drums, lead and rhythm guitar. Quote, "The Beatles were always looking for new sounds, always looking to a new horizon, and it was a continual but happy strain to try and provide new things for them," explained George Martin. "They were always wanting to try new instruments even when they didn't know much about them," unquote. Influenced by Bob Dylan's introspective songwriting, John Lennon wrote, "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away," for the Beatles' Help album. It was recorded in February 1965. "That's me in my Dylan period," described John Lennon. "Instead of projecting myself into a situation, would try to express what I felt about myself, which I'd done in my books. I think it was Dylan who helped me realize that, not by any discussion or anything, but by hearing his work, unquote. Quote, to John, Bob might not have been as important an inspiration as Elvis Presley, but Dylan's magic had stopped an entire counterculture dead in its tracks, and John, too, wrote music journalist Al Aronowitz. In effect, Dylan had tapped John on the shoulder and made him turn around to look, unquote. The Rubber Soul and Revolver albums marked a departure from the early sounds of Beatlemania like Love Me Do and Can't Buy Me Love, and within only 2 short years, the Beatles showed a maturity and evolution in their song lyrics and instrumentation. We're a bit older than those lads that started out, said Ringo Starr in 1968. You can't live all your life by what other people want. We can't go on forever as 4 clean little mop-tops playing She Loves You, unquote. The new sound was also influenced by the Beatles' new interest in smoking pot. They first got high on August 28, 1964 with Bob Dylan. That is the day when Bob Dylan met the Beatles for the first time. The Beatles were in New York City on their American tour and Dylan specifically came down from Woodstock, New York to see them. With his friend, music journalist Al Aronowitz, Dylan went over to the Hotel Delmonico where the Beatles were staying. Aronowitz had just written his second cover story about the Beatles, which appeared in the August 8 to 15, 1964 issue of the Saturday Evening Post. He helped arrange the meeting since he knew both the Beatles and Dylan. To me, John Lennon was Dylan's English reflection through the looking glass and across the sea in the land of left-hand drive, wrote Al Aronowitz. As soon as I got to know John well enough, I started telling him that he ought to meet Bob, unquote. It was Aronowitz who first proposed that the Beatles try marijuana when he was in Liverpool covering the Beatles. John said he would try some if I brought it to him, explained Aronowitz. That night in New York, all 4 Beatles and even Brian Epstein tried marijuana for the first time. They all started laughing hysterically at each other as an effect of inhaling the illegal substance. Paul McCartney believed he had discovered the meaning of life while he was high and instructed Mal Evans to write down everything he said. We smoked and laughed all night, John Lennon recalled. Dylan kept answering our phone, saying, "This is Beatlemania here." It was ridiculous, unquote. Yes, we all probably had one of the best laughs of our lives that night at the Hotel Delmonico, recalled Aronowitz. Certainly I hadn't laughed so hard since the first time I smoked marijuana. That's why, after that night at the Delmonico, whenever John wanted to smoke some pot, he would say, "Let's have a larf," unquote. On October 26, 1965, the Beatles went to Buckingham Palace where they were honored by the Queen of England. They each received MBE, Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, medals recognizing them for service to their country, usually given to public servants and military men. Many previous recipients of the award returned theirs in protest, seeing it as an insult to be put in the same category as vulgar nincompoops, as protester Hector Dupuy stated. In response, George Harrison said, "If Dupuy doesn't want the medal, he had better give it to us. Then we can give it to our manager, Brian Epstein." MBE really stands for Mr. Brian Epstein, unquote. The Beatles did not show much enthusiasm for receiving the award in interviews. In fact, John Lennon was hesitant to accept it. Taking the MBE was a sell-out for me, John Lennon admitted later. Brian and a few other people persuaded me that it was in our interests to. But I'm glad, really, that I did accept it, because it meant that 4 years later, I could use it to make a gesture, unquote. That gesture for John Lennon was to return his MBE in 1969 to protest Britain's involvement in the Biafra War. Meanwhile, Paul and George wore their medals on the 1967 Sgt. Pepper cover. "I was never going to send mine back, I knew that," Ringo later confessed. John did, he had his reasons, but not me. At the time, I was very proud. It meant a lot to me, unquote. During the MBE ceremony, the Beatles took a bathroom break. They were rumored to have smoked marijuana in the palace bathroom, as depicted by the newspaper headline, "Pot at Palace Riddle over the Beatles." When Bob Dylan heard this, he joked to friend and journalist, Al Aronowitz, "Maybe we shouldn't have turned them on," unquote. Quote, "We, however, were giggling like crazy because we had just smoked a joint in the loose of Buckingham Palace. "We were so nervous," said John Lennon. However, George Harrison disputes Lennon's claim, quote, "In there we smoked a cigarette." Years later, I'm sure John was thinking back and remembering, "Oh yes, we went in the toilet and smoked and it turned into a reefer." Because what could be the worst thing you could do before you meet the Queen? Smoke a reefer. But we never did, unquote. Marijuana was becoming prominent in the Beatles' daily life. In fact, McCartney's "Got to Get You Into My Life," which appeared on the Revolver album, was written about pot because he liked it so much. Quote, "When the Beatles started talking publicly about smoking marijuana, Elvis thought it was terrible," revealed Memphis Mafia member Marty Lacker. He felt they were a bad influence on kids. In the meantime, he was getting blown out of his skull on pills, unquote. But the Beatles never smoked pot in front of George Martin. Drugs may have influenced their song lyrics and musical sound, but the Beatles remained professional in the recording studio. They were doing things nobody was doing, Dylan told author Anthony Scaduto in 1971. Their chords were outrageous, just outrageous, and the harmonies made it all valid. Everybody else thought they were for the teeny boppers, that they were gonna pass right away. But it was obvious to me that they had staying power. I knew they were pointing the direction of where music had to go. In my head, the Beatles were it, unquote. There was a lot of faith involved in everything we did, and the people around us had to share that faith or it wouldn't have worked, said Paul McCartney. Brian had to have faith in us, George Martin had to have faith in us. This is how it was for the Beatles. You had to have faith. We had to have faith in each other, unquote. However, it wasn't all rosy between Bob Dylan and the Beatles. Dylan wrote the song, Fourth Time Around, in 1966 as a confrontational stance to John Lennon. Known as Bob Dylan impersonating John Lennon, according to author Richard Thomas, Dylan is essentially telling the Beatles, "Stay away from what I'm doing." Quote, "Almost single-handedly, the Beatles infected pop with psychedelia," commented Aronowitz. Until the advent of rap, pop music remained largely derivative of that night at the Delmonico. That meeting didn't just change pop music, it changed the times, unquote. Elvis Presley at the same time, quote, admired the Beatles, and yet he felt threatened by the Beatles, said author Peter Guralnick. Sometimes it made him angry how disrespectful the Beatles and Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones were toward the public and their fans, but most of all he was envious of the freedom that they evidently seemed to feel and to flaunt, unquote. On the surface, the king of rock and roll and the voice of a generation, Bob Dylan, seemed polar opposites. Dylan's early portrayal as a humble folk singer conveying a serious political message appeared in sharp contrast to Presley's eternal image of rock and roll flash and showmanship. However, both were considered revolutionaries in their genre of music, and yet neither Presley nor Dylan were comfortable with their respective titles. Elvis was a huge influence on Bob Dylan. As a teenager growing up in Hibbing, Minnesota, Dylan idolized Elvis. He played in several rock and roll bands during high school and afterwards, but none of his groups ever seemed to stay together. Dylan realized early on that if he wanted to make it in the music business, his best chance would be to go out on his own. In just a few short years, Dylan made a name for himself in the folk music genre. In Dylan's mind, he was just riding the wave of folk music that was gaining steam in the early 1960s, similar to how Elvis felt he was riding the wave of rock and roll in the 1950s. However, by 1964, when Dylan realized he was being heralded as the voice of a generation, he quickly dismissed the label and tried to move away from the folk scene. Returning to his original interests in rock and roll music, Dylan transformed his career by going electric, much to the disapproval of his fans at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965. During this performance, Dylan performed rock and roll songs in public for the first time, using an electric guitar instead of the traditional acoustic guitar used for folk music. How could this folk hero, famous for writing political songs like "Blowin' in the Wind" and "A Hard Rain's a Gonna Fall," betray his fans and turn to rock and roll? Simple, Dylan's heart had always been in rock and roll, and he was originally turned on to it by none other than Elvis Presley. Quote, "When I first heard Elvis's voice, I just knew that I wasn't going to work for anybody, and nobody was going to be my boss," Bob Dylan said in 1987. Hearing him for the first time was like busting out of jail, unquote. Dylan and Presley were extremely similar in one important aspect: they both experienced a frustrating inner turmoil about the direction of their music. While Dylan's public transformation from a folk singer to a rock and roller happened literally overnight, Elvis Presley's evolution from rock and roll to his rhythm and blues and gospel roots was a more gradual change. When Elvis got out of the army in 1960, his recording started to move away from the edgy rock and roll songs he was best known for. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Elvis released albums that were focused more on country, rhythm and blues, and gospel. When asked in 1972 why he didn't sing as many hard rock songs, Elvis replied, "It's very difficult to find that type of song. It's hard to find good material nowadays, for everybody, for all of us," unquote. Material that wasn't hard to find were gospel songs. In between his movie soundtracks and mainstream studio releases, Elvis released 3 gospel albums: His Hand in Mine, 1960, How Great Thou Art, 1967, and He Touched Me, 1972. Working with the Jordanaires, Elvis was finally living his musical dream of being in a gospel group, even if it was built around himself. After a recording session in the mid-1960s, Elvis gushed to the Jordanaires, "Fellas, I really believe, if there hadn't been a you, there wouldn't be a me," unquote. When asked what she thought Elvis would be doing if he was still alive on his 75th birthday, Priscilla Presley answered, "I don't know if he'd be doing rock and roll right now. I think that maybe he'd be going into gospel. Maybe even preaching a little bit," unquote. "I think Elvis felt out of touch with the 60s, but not with the early Beatles," explained Presley's cousin, Billy Smith. He thought the early Beatles were real similar to his early music. He loved the loud, hard-driving sound that they had. He wanted that himself. For example, he'd ask for the bass to be brought forward a little more in places. And he wanted his voice mixed down, and the music brought up louder, unquote. Many times, especially in the 1960s, after Presley recorded the songs the way he wanted, RCA would go in and tinker with the sound. Elvis frequently got upset about how his record company kept tampering with the music. They always chose to make Presley's voice the focal point of the recording at the request of Colonel Parker. He'd play a Beatles record, Smith continued, and he'd say, "This is what I'm looking for right here. I want that drive back. And I don't want my voice to be brought out front. If it's there, I want the background singers brought out with me," unquote. Elvis did not necessarily like to rehearse in the recording studio. In the early days, he would walk in with the demos he had selected to record, and the band would have to learn them on the spot. How each musician played was up to the individual, said Presley's guitarist, Scotty Moore, but Elvis would sometimes make suggestions by asking, "Can you do this?" If the answer was no, he would say, "Do the best you can," unquote. Presley would never single out any of the musicians if they made a mistake. Photographer Alfred Wertheimer, who observed many of those recording sessions in 1956, explained, quote, "In his own reserved manner, he kept control, he made himself responsible. When somebody else made a mistake, Elvis sang off-key. The offender picked up the cue. He never criticized anyone, never got mad at anybody but himself. He'd just say, 'Okay, fellas, I goofed,' unquote." To warm himself up, Elvis would sing gospel songs before a recording session. Sometimes Presley would sing gospel in the studio for hours with the Jordanaires before ever working on an official record. "There was no one that could put as much feeling into a song," said Gordon Stoker of the Jordanaires. "Of all the artists we worked with, they all used a word sheet up in front of them, music or word sheet, but Presley could listen to a demo 3 times and get up at the microphone and sing it, every word, never miss a word. That tells you he lived each song that he was recording, every word meant something to him, and he made it the best he could make it," unquote. After 10 years of working with producer Steve Sholes with help from Chet Atkins, Presley began working with producer Felton Jarvis at RCA starting in May 1966. Ironically, Jarvis was a former recording artist who released a song in 1959 called "Don't Knock Elvis." Whereas Sholes acted in more of a supervisory role in the recording studio, Jarvis was a true hands-on producer, and he also happened to be a huge Elvis fan. According to friend George Klein, over time Elvis had come to trust Felton as a friend and musical colleague. Under Felton's watch, the careers of Elvis and Bob Dylan merged when Presley decided to record Dylan's "Tomorrow Is a Long Time." Elvis recorded the song during the How Great Thou Art sessions on May 26, 1966. He was inspired after hearing Odetta's version of the song. Presley's version appeared on the Spin Out soundtrack album in October 1966. Presley also recorded Dylan's 1962 classic, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right, on May 16, 1971 at RCA Studio B in Nashville. Elvis originally recorded a 12-minute version of the song, repeating the verses several times. An edited version of the song under 3 minutes in length was featured on the 1973 album, Elvis. Elvis sang an informal version of Dylan's I Shall Be Released, 2 verses only, during a recording session on May 20, 1971. It was later released in the box set of Presley's 1970s songs, Walk a Mile in My Shoes. When Bob Dylan first visited Sun Records, he reportedly kissed the ground where Elvis recorded. Dylan was later quoted as saying, "The highlight of my career? That's easy, Elvis recording one of my songs," unquote. In the spring of 1966, the Beatles recorded their most groundbreaking album to date, Revolver. From April to June 1966, the Beatles recorded the album at EMI Studios in London. Revolver has that quality of rubber soul because it's the follow-on, said Ringo Starr. We were really starting to find ourselves in the studio. We were finding what we could do, just being the four of us and playing our instruments. The overdubbing got better. The songs got more interesting. I feel to this day that though we did take certain substances, we never did it to a great extent at the session. We were really hard workers. That's another thing about the Beatles, we worked like dogs to get it right. However, EMI Studios was not necessarily the Beatles' first choice for where to record this particular album. They considered using the Stax studio in Memphis, Tennessee to record what would become Revolver. It didn't happen for a lot of different reasons, said Steve Cropper, a songwriter, sideman and producer with the Stax Records label, but I'm not sure it ever would have happened, unquote. Word got out in March 1966 that the Beatles were planning to record at Stax after Brian Epstein visited Memphis to scout the area. One of the local Memphis papers reported that the Beatles were scheduled to arrive on April 9. However, Stax co-owner Estelle Axton, who gave Epstein a tour of the city, suggested that security would be a challenge for the Beatles in Memphis. They want a house and a suitable one is hard to find, explained Axton. We're not used to something like this in a town this size, unquote. Ultimately, according to Cropper, Brian Epstein decided that the Beatles couldn't come to Memphis because of security. We thought we had come up with a great solution for that, Cropper said. Because of Stax Records' location in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, the Beatles, quote, could have walked down the street at Stax and nobody would have said anything, but they didn't know that, unquote. The Beatles loved the Memphis sound, not only because of Elvis, but also the artists who recorded at Stax, including Otis Redding, Booker T. and the MGs and Rufus Thomas. The possible Memphis recording session was confirmed by an unearthed letter which surfaced in 2015. George Harrison had sent a letter postmarked May 7, 1966 to Paul Drew, Atlanta DJ and program director who traveled with the Beatles during their 1964 and 1965 world tours and formed a close friendship with the group. In the handwritten letter, Harrison thanked Drew for sending over records from the States and talked about the album the Beatles were currently working on, which was Revolver. At the end of the letter, Harrison mentioned the idea of recording with producer Jim Stewart. Stewart was the co-owner of the Stax Records label and studio. This was the first time the Beatles seriously considered working with a producer other than George Martin. Did you hear that we nearly recorded in Memphis with Jim Stewart? George Harrison wrote. We would all like it a lot, but too many people get insane with money ideas at the mention of the word Beatles, and so it fell through, unquote. The Stax studio was a converted movie theater which, quote, still had the sloped floor where the theater seats had once been. Because the room was imbalanced, it created an acoustic anomaly that was audible on recordings, often giving them a big, deep yet raw sound. Because of the distinctive sound, Soul music fans can tell often within the first few notes if a song was recorded at Stax, according to soul music historian Rob Bowman. Paul McCartney also made a remark relating to Stax at a press conference on August 24, 1966 in Los Angeles. When asked if the Beatles would ever record in the US, McCartney said, "We tried actually, but it was a financial matter. A little trouble over that one. We tried," unquote. When asked why the Beatles didn't come to Memphis to record earlier in the year, George Harrison gave this answer at a press conference in Memphis in August 1966, quote, "Little things kept getting in the way, like money. We wanted to come. A couple of tracks would have been much better if we had come. We wanted Steve Cropper, a guitarist for Booker T and the MGs, to direct the session. He's the best we've heard," unquote. Elvis Presley would do his last major studio recording sessions at Stax in July and December 1973. Along with lack of control over song selection on albums, Elvis also had no say in the photos that were used on his album covers. Instead, it was Colonel Parker who selected the photos for Presley's albums. The Colonel had a tight rein on all of Presley's official photographs since he saw the photos as another source of income for him and his client. According to Marty Lacker, quote, "Every still photo that was taken for a movie, or on a movie set or on location, even if they were taken by the studio photographers, had to be handed over to Colonel with the negatives. He controlled them all. And he sold RCA one picture at a time. He'd say, 'This is what the cover is going to be, and this is what it's going to cost you,' unquote." In a 1965 interview, Presley suggested that he wasn't a fan of publicity photo shoots for his films. "I try to cut the time down to 3 or 4 hours, but sometimes you have to pose for 6 or 8. A man only has so many different smiles, and I don't have many," unquote. The Colonel believed that the most marketable images to help attract sales from Elvis fans featured just a simple photo of Presley. He assumed that's what the fans wanted to see on the album covers, and Elvis didn't seem too concerned over what photos were used. "I designed all these album covers," Colonel Parker explained. "People say they're in poor taste, but we're selling millions of records. These guys at RCA want to do fancy artistic stuff, but they don't know who the audience is," unquote. In contrast, the Beatles were more in tune to the image that was portrayed on their album covers, especially later in their career. John Lennon had gone to art school, and all of the Beatles had an appreciation for the artistic photos that Astrid Kircher had taken of them back in Hamburg. While their first album, Please Please Me, featured a standard color photograph of the Beatles, things changed with their second album when they hired photographer Robert Freeman to take the photo. Freeman was a London photographer whose work had appeared in the Sunday Times and other magazines. He approached the Beatles by sending them his portfolio of shots of jazz musicians like John Coltrane and Dizzy Gillespie. Quote, "They never proposed any design for the album covers," explained Freeman. "They always just let me come up with something, and then I would propose it to them and they would say, 'Okay, let's go ahead with it.' So there was no kind of art direction, either from them or from anybody in the middle," unquote. Freeman took the photos for 5 of the Beatles album covers beginning in 1963 from With the Beatles to Rubber Soul in 1965. The young photographer brought an artistic style that helped shape the Beatles' unique visual image. Quote, "This cover shot, for With the Beatles, was really an extension of my black and white jazz photographs," said Freeman. The picture had a mood and directness that was the antithesis of the way groups usually appeared in the pop media. George Martin deserves credit for supporting this approach, because color was the norm for pop albums at the time, unquote. The Beatles and Freeman wanted the dramatic black and white cover of the Beatles' 4 shadowy faces to contain no titles or text, just the photograph. However, they were overruled by EMI. Quote, "At the time neither the Beatles nor Brian Epstein had authority over those decisions," said Freeman. "That changed when we came to Rubber Soul," unquote. Rubber Soul was the first Beatles album that did not display the name Beatles on the cover. After Rubber Soul, the Beatles became more hands-on with their album covers. They hired their friend, Klaus Voormann, to design the Revolver cover. However, in the US, Capitol Records was not only rearranging the song selection on the albums and choosing different titles for the albums, but they also were selecting different photographs for the Beatles' US album covers. But with the success of the Rubber Soul album, Capitol was now following the Beatles' lead on album cover photos. In between Rubber Soul and Revolver, Capitol had another album's worth of songs that they wanted to release in the US in June 1966. The album was called Yesterday and Today, and Capitol went along with the photo that the Beatles sent from England to use on the cover. What originally started out as a playful photo shoot resulted in a gruesome scene. The photograph by Robert Whittaker featured baby doll parts and pieces of raw meat strewn over the Beatles, who were wearing white lab coats. The photo session was not originally intended to produce an album cover, but the Beatles felt that the photo could be their statement on the Vietnam War. John Lennon said the cover was, quote, inspired by the boredom and resentment of having to do another photo session and another Beatles thing. We were sick to death of it, unquote. Since the Beatles were unhappy with how Capitol Records was slicing and dicing their albums in the US, they unintentionally got their revenge. Some fans believed the photograph was the Beatles' response to the butchering of their US releases. However, people who saw advance copies of the cover had a strong negative reaction, so it was pulled from US shelves immediately. Reportedly, 750,000 albums had already been printed, with approximately 60,000 copies sent to retailers and media contacts in advance of the June 1966 release date. On June 14, 1966, Capitol sent out a letter to retailers and reviewers requesting that copies of the album be returned immediately. Quote, the original cover, created in England, was intended as pop art satire, the letter explained. However, a sampling of public opinion in the United States indicates that the cover design is subject to misinterpretation. For this reason, and to avoid any possible controversy or undeserved harm to the Beatles' image or reputation, Capitol has chosen to withdraw the LP and substitute a more generally acceptable design, unquote. To cut costs, a more traditional photo of the Beatles was pasted over the original photo of those albums already printed. These album covers, nicknamed the Butcher covers, are rare, and over time have become a valuable collector's item. I thought it was gross, and I also thought it was stupid, confessed George Harrison. Sometimes we all did stupid things, thinking it was cool and hip when it was naive and dumb, and that was one of them.